The security guard's boots echoed against hospital tile as he escorted Sarah Mitchell through the emergency department, past nurses who wouldn't meet her eyes, past doctors whispering behind clipboards, past patients she'd treated just hours before. Rain hammered the windows of Riverside General Hospital while she clutched a cardboard box containing a coffee mug, her nursing license certificate, and 10 years of loyalty nobody gave a damn about. Hospital VP Victoria Brennan had just accused her of stealing fentanyl from the pharmacy, called her a junkie and a thief in front of the entire night shift, and banned her from the building effective immediately. What Victoria didn't know, what nobody in this sterile hallway knew, was that the exhausted woman they were humiliating like trash had spent 3 tours keeping Marines alive in places where morphine ran out and artillery didn't stop. The elevator doors opened. Sarah stepped inside. And that's when the building shook so violently that ceiling tiles crashed to the floor and every alarm in Riverside General started screaming at once. Before we go any further, if you want to see how Sarah's story ends, stick around until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to it. The box slipped from Sarah's hands when the explosion hit. Coffee mug shattered. Glass scattered across elevator tile. Through the closing doors, she saw nurses stumbling, doctors grabbing door frames, IV poles toppling like dominoes. The fluorescent lights flickered twice before the backup generators kicked in with a mechanical groan that sounded like the whole hospital was choking. Sarah jammed her hand between the closing elevator doors. They bounced open. She shouldn't go back. She knew that. 20 minutes ago, Victoria Brennan had stood in the administration office with 2 security guards flanking her like Sarah was dangerous, like she was some kind of criminal who needed to be contained and removed before she contaminated the entire hospital with her presence. "We have evidence," Victoria had said, her voice cold and clinical. "Pharmacy logs show unauthorized access to the controlled substances cabinet on your shifts. Multiple times. The timestamps match your badge swipes." Sarah had stared at the printed reports, at the highlighted rows that supposedly proved her guilt, and felt something crack inside her chest. "I didn't take anything. The evidence says otherwise." "Then your evidence is wrong." Victoria's smile hadn't reached her eyes. "Security will escort you out. Don't come back. If you're seen on hospital property again, we'll have you arrested for trespassing." Now Sarah stood in the elevator with glass crunching under her sneakers and alarms shrieking through the walls, and every instinct she'd learned in Kandahar telling her that something had gone catastrophically wrong outside this building. She ran, not toward the exit, toward the ER. The security guard who'd escorted her out was nowhere in sight, probably helping with whatever disaster had just announced itself. Sarah pushed through the stairwell door and took the steps 3 at a time, her badge still clipped to her scrub pocket, even though it had been deactivated 30 minutes ago. She didn't care. People were about to start dying, and she wasn't going to stand in a parking lot while it happened. The ER entrance erupted into chaos before she even reached it. Ambulance sirens wailed. Radio chatter crackled through speakers. Someone was screaming about a tanker truck and a city bus and multiple vehicles, and "Move, move, move, we need stretchers now." Sarah burst through the double doors. Blood everywhere. A woman clutching her daughter, both of them covered in glass. An elderly man sitting on the floor with his arm bent wrong. A teenager with a piece of metal embedded in his shoulder, eyes wide and glassy with shock. And more coming. God, there were more coming. Paramedics wheeling in stretchers faster than the nurses could triage them. Dr. Marcus Webb stood frozen near the nurses' station, his face pale. "We need to activate mass casualty protocol," someone said. "We can't handle this many." Where's the charge nurse?" "I don't know, she's not answering." Sarah's training overrode everything else. "Trauma 1 through 4, her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Open them all. Pull every available nurse from MedSurg. Get the OR teams down here now. Somebody call the blood bank and tell them we need O negative on standby." People turned to look at her. Dr. Webb blinked. "Sarah, you're not supposed to, Triage tags," Sarah interrupted, already moving toward the supply closet. "Red, yellow, green. You know this. We practiced this. Stop standing around and start sorting, or people are going to die in your waiting room." She grabbed an armful of colored tags and started distributing them to nurses who were staring at her like they'd forgotten how to move. A young nurse named Jessica Park took the tags with shaking hands. I don't know what to do, Jessica whispered. Yes, you do. Sarah met her eyes. Breathing, bleeding, brain. That's your order. You assess in 30 seconds and you move on. Don't think, just do. Jessica nodded and ran. Sarah turned back to the chaos and started sorting the wounded with the same mechanical efficiency she'd used in combat. The woman with the glass, green tag, superficial lacerations, she could wait. The elderly man with the broken arm, yellow tag, painful but not immediately life-threatening. The teenager with the metal in his shoulder, red tag, potential arterial involvement, needed surgery within the hour. She moved from patient to patient, her hands steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Someone grabbed her arm. Victoria Brennan. The hospital VP looked furious, her perfectly styled hair disheveled from the chaos, her expression carved from ice. "What are you doing here?" Victoria hissed. "I told you to leave." Sarah pulled her arm free and kept moving. "You need me right now." "You're fired. You're trespassing." "Then call security." Sarah knelt beside a man who was coughing up blood, checking his airway, tilting his head back. "But do it after I save his life." Victoria's face went red. "I will have you arrested." "Do it later." Sarah flagged down a passing doctor and pointed at the man with the blood. "Pneumothorax, needs a chest tube now." The doctor nodded and wheeled the patient away. Victoria stood there, trembling with rage, but she didn't call security. Maybe because every available security guard was helping move patients. Maybe because even she could see that removing Sarah from the building right now would turn a disaster into a massacre. Either way, Victoria disappeared into the crowd. Sarah kept working. More patients flooded in. A child with a head injury, an unconscious woman with crush injuries to her chest, a man screaming about his wife. Where was his wife? Someone find his wife! The ER descended deeper into chaos. Equipment started failing. One of the ventilators sparked and died. A crash cart's battery gave out in the middle of a code. The backup generator sputtered, and the lights dimmed for 3 long seconds before surging back to life. "We're losing power," Dr. Webb said, his voice tight. "Then work faster," Sarah replied. She was stitching a laceration on a teenage girl's forehead when she saw him. Louise Carter. Another nurse. Older, experienced, someone who'd worked at Riverside General for 15 years and never said much to anyone. He was standing near the pharmacy access terminal, typing something into the computer with quick, furtive movements that didn't match the chaos around him. Sarah's hands stilled. She watched Luis glance over his shoulder, check to make sure nobody was looking, then swipe his badge and access the controlled substances cabinet. He pulled out 2 vials of fentanyl, pocketed them, and logged the access under someone else's credentials. Under Sarah's credentials. Her stomach dropped. Luis closed the cabinet and walked away like nothing had happened. The girl under Sarah's hands whimpered. "Are you done?" Sarah blinked, forced herself to focus, finished the suture. "Yeah, you're done. Keep it dry for a week." The girl's mother led her away. Sarah stood there with bloody gloves and a sick feeling spreading through her chest because she'd just watched someone frame her and there was nothing she could do about it. If she said something now, in the middle of this disaster, nobody would believe her. They'd think she was deflecting, making excuses, blaming someone else to save herself. She'd have to deal with it later. Right now, people needed her. Sarah moved back into the flow of the ER, pushing the anger down deep where it couldn't interfere with her hands. She stabilized patients. She assisted with intubations. She held pressure on bleeding wounds while doctors worked. And she didn't think about Louise Carter or Victoria Brennan, or the fact that her entire career had just been destroyed by someone else's greed. She just worked. An hour passed. Then 2. The wounded kept coming, but the flow slowed. Paramedics started bringing in the last of the survivors from the crash site, the ones who'd been trapped in wreckage, the ones who'd taken longer to extract. Sarah was checking vitals on an older woman with a fractured pelvis when Jessica Park appeared at her elbow, pale and exhausted. "There's a kid," Jessica said quietly. "Trauma 2. He's not breathing right, and Dr. Webb can't figure out why." Sarah followed her. The boy was maybe 7 years old, his chest rising and falling too fast, his lips tinged blue. Dr. Webb stood over him with a stethoscope, listening, frowning. "Breath sounds are diminished on the left," Webb muttered, "but there's no obvious injury." "Move," Sarah said. Webb looked up, startled. Sarah pushed past him and pressed her hands against the boy's chest, feeling for the subtle difference in movement, the thing you learned to recognize when you'd seen enough trauma in places where X-ray machines didn't exist. Tension pneumothorax, she said. His lung collapsed. You need to decompress it now, or his heart's going to stop. Webb hesitated. I don't see any... Because it's internal. Sarah grabbed a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart and held it out. You put this in the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, or I do it. Your choice. Webb took the needle. His hand shook. Sarah guided his hand to the correct position on the boy's chest, felt the resistance as the needle penetrated skin and muscle and pleura, heard the hiss of air escaping as the pressure released. The boy gasped. His lips turned pink. Webb stared at Sarah like he'd never seen her before. How did you know that? Sarah stripped off her gloves and turned away. Because I've done it in worse places than this. She didn't elaborate. Didn't explain that she'd performed the same procedure inside a blown-out building in Helmand Province, while mortar rounds shook the walls and a Marine sergeant bled out 6 feet away. Didn't mention that she'd learned to trust her hands more than her equipment because equipment broke and hands didn't. She just moved on to the next patient. The ER slowly stabilized. Patients were transferred upstairs or sent to surgery or discharged with instructions and follow-up appointments. The chaos receded like a tide going out. Nurses started cleaning blood off the floors. Doctors disappeared to write charts. The storm outside began to ease. Sarah washed her hands in the staff bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She looked like hell. Blood on her scrubs. Hair escaping from her ponytail. Dark circles under her eyes. The face of someone who'd just worked a disaster without sleep and didn't know if she still had a job. Victoria would come for her soon. Sarah knew that. The moment this crisis was over, Victoria would remember that Sarah wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be touching patients, wasn't supposed to exist inside this building anymore. Sarah dried her hands and walked back into the ER. Victoria was already waiting. The hospital VP stood near the nurses' station with 2 security guards, her arms crossed, her expression cold and satisfied. You're done now, Victoria said. You've helped enough. Time to leave. Sarah didn't move. Those people would be dead if I'd left. That's not my concern. It should be. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You were terminated for theft. That hasn't changed. The fact that you decided to trespass and interfere during an emergency doesn't absolve you of anything. I didn't steal anything. The logs say otherwise. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, to explain what she'd seen Luis do, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Victoria had already decided Sarah was guilty. Evidence that contradicted that conclusion would be ignored or explained away. Leave now, Victoria said, or I'll have you arrested. The security guard stepped forward. Sarah looked around the ER. At Jessica Park, who wouldn't meet her eyes. At Dr. Webb, who was suddenly very interested in his clipboard. At Luis Carter, who stood near the pharmacy terminal with his hands in his pockets and a faint smile on his face. Nobody was going to defend her. She'd just saved their asses, and nobody was going to say a word. Sarah turned toward the exit. That's when the power died. Not the flicker from before. Complete darkness. The backup generator groaned once and went silent. Every light in the ER cut out. Equipment alarms started wailing as battery backups kicked in. Somewhere in the distance, something large and mechanical made a grinding noise and stopped. Emergency lights flickered to life, casting everything in red. Victoria's face went pale. What just happened? Nobody answered. Dr. Webb was already running toward the ICU, where ventilator patients were suddenly breathing on their own without mechanical assistance. Jessica sprinted toward the medication refrigerators to check the temperature logs before everything spoiled. Chaos erupted again. A different kind this time, the kind that came from infrastructure failure instead of trauma. Sarah stood in the red emergency lighting and felt her phone buzz. She pulled it out. A news alert. Breaking. Multiple vehicle collision on Highway 40 involves military convoy. National Guard deploying to Riverside General Hospital for emergency support. Sarah's blood went cold. Military convoy. National Guard deployment. She looked toward the ER entrance, toward the rain-soaked parking lot beyond the windows, and saw them. Headlights. Dozens of them. Heavy vehicles rolling through the storm like a mechanized invasion force. The first Humvee stopped directly outside the entrance. Soldiers climbed out, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. They wore combat fatigues and carried equipment cases and radios and portable generators. An officer emerged from the lead vehicle, a woman with short gray hair and colonel's insignia on her collar, her face hard and weathered. The officer walked through the ER entrance and stopped. She scanned the chaos with the expression of someone evaluating a battlefield. Then her eyes landed on Sarah. The officer went completely still. "Mitchell?" she said. Sarah's throat closed. She knew that voice, knew that face. Hadn't seen either in 4 years, but would recognize them anywhere. Colonel Elena Voss. Sarah's commanding officer from her second deployment. The woman who'd written her commendation after the Kandahar field hospital took mortar fire, and Sarah kept working through the attack. The officer who'd told her she was the best trauma nurse Voss had ever seen, and if Sarah ever needed anything at all, to call. Voss crossed the ER in 4 long strides. "What the hell are you doing here?" Voss demanded. Sarah's voice came out hoarse. "Working." "Bullshit. You're covered in blood and standing in the dark and—" Voss stopped, looked at the security guard still hovering nearby, looked at Victoria, who'd gone very quiet. "Why are there security guards?" Victoria stepped forward, recovering her composure. "Colonel, I'm Victoria Brennan, VP of Operations. This woman is no longer employed here. She was just leaving." Voss turned to look at Victoria like she'd never seen something so insignificant. "Leaving," Voss repeated slowly. "Yes, she's been terminated." "For what?" Victoria hesitated. "Theft." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Voss looked at Sarah. "Is that true?" "No," Sarah said. "Did you steal anything?" "No." Voss turned back to Victoria. "Then why are you wasting my time with this bureaucratic horseshit when my soldiers are setting up emergency power and you should be coordinating patient care?" Victoria's face flushed. "I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand perfectly." Voss's voice could have cut steel. "You fired one of the best trauma nurses I've ever worked with in the middle of a mass casualty event during a power failure while my people are trying to keep your hospital from collapsing. Is that about right?" Victoria opened her mouth, closed it. "The evidence, I don't care about your evidence." Voss pulled out her radio. "Mitchell stays. She works. You leave her alone. Are we clear? You can't just—" "Yes, I can. This is a federal disaster zone now. That means I have operational authority over every person in this building until the emergency is resolved. So either you help or you get out of the way." Victoria stood there trembling with rage and humiliation. Voss ignored her and turned to Sarah. "You okay?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Because I need you." Voss gestured at the chaos around them. "My convoy was transporting medical supplies to Fort Hamilton when some jackass in a tanker truck ran a red light and turned Highway 40 into a war zone. We've got 30 injured soldiers who need triage and treatment, and your ER is already maxed out. Can you help?" Sarah looked at the soldiers moving through the hospital with generators and equipment, looked at Victoria, who was staring at her with pure hatred, looked at Colonel Voss, who was waiting for an answer. "Yeah," Sarah said, "I can help." Voss smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen in hours. "Then let's get to work." The next hour blurred together. Soldiers set up portable generators in the ER. Lights came back on. Equipment resumed normal operation. Voss's medics worked alongside civilian doctors, coordinating care with the kind of seamless efficiency that only came from training and trust. Sarah moved between military and civilian patients, her skills dusted off and deployed again after years of dormancy. She assisted with a field amputation, managed a combat medic through his first civilian code, taught Jessica how to pack a wound the way you did when hemostatic gauze was all you had and the hospital was still 20 minutes away. And slowly, patient by patient, the crisis came under control. Dawn broke through the windows, gray and weak. Sarah was checking the vitals on a soldier with a fractured femur when Voss appeared at her side. "We need to talk," Voss said quietly. Sarah followed her to an empty consultation room. Voss closed the door and leaned against it, her expression serious. "What happened?" Voss asked. "Why did they fire you?" Sarah told her everything. The missing medications, the falsified logs, the accusation. Luis Carter stealing fentanyl while Sarah watched. Victoria's immediate termination without investigation. Voss listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, Voss was quiet for a long moment. "You saw this nurse steal medication," Voss said slowly, "and log it under your credentials." "Yes." "Can you prove it?" "No, it was chaos. Nobody else was paying attention." Voss pulled out her phone. "What's the nurse's name?" "Luis Carter, but I don't think—" "I'm not asking what you think." Voss typed something into her phone. "I'm asking what you saw. Because if someone is stealing controlled substances from a hospital, that's not just your problem. That's a federal problem. Especially when those substances end up on the street and soldiers end up buying them and overdosing in barracks." Sarah went cold. "You think Luis is selling?" "I think someone is. And I think your hospital administration knows about it and is covering it up." Voss looked up from her phone. "Otherwise, they would have investigated before firing you. Instead, they pushed you out immediately and publicly. That's not incompetence. That's damage control." "Victoria wouldn't she?" Voss raised an eyebrow. "How much do you know about Victoria Brennan's finances?" "Nothing. Because you trusted your employer to be honest." Voss's expression hardened. "I don't. I'm going to make some calls. In the meantime, you stay close. Don't leave the hospital. Don't talk to anyone about this conversation." "Elena, I can't just—" "Yes, you can." Voss opened the door. "You saved lives tonight. Mine, your colleagues, those patients. You did your job even after they threw you away like garbage. Now let me do mine." Voss left. Sarah stood alone in the consultation room, exhausted and wired and terrified about what was about to happen. She walked back into the ER. The chaos had receded, but the aftermath remained. Nurses moved through the space like ghosts, cleaning and charting and trying to process everything that had happened. Dr. Webb sat at the nurses' station with his head in his hands. Jessica was crying quietly in the break room. Luis Carter was nowhere to be seen. Sarah checked on her patients, the ones she'd triaged, the ones she'd stabilized, the ones who would have died without her intervention. They were all stable now, transferred to ICU or surgery or discharged home. The hospital had survived the night. But Sarah had a sick feeling the nightmare was just beginning. She was updating a chart when two men in suits walked through the ER entrance. Federal agents. They moved with the deliberate calm of people who carried guns and authority and didn't care who knew it. One of them approached the nurses' station and pulled out a badge. "Special Agent Rodriguez, FBI," he said. "We need to speak with your hospital administration immediately." Dr. Webb stood up slowly. "What's this about?" "Where is Victoria Brennan?" Webb pointed toward the administrative wing. The agents walked away without another word. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the chart. Something was happening, something big. She could feel it in the way the agents moved, in the way other hospital staff were starting to whisper, in the way the entire building seemed to be holding its breath. 20 minutes later, Victoria Brennan walked through the ER escorted by the two federal agents. She was in handcuffs. The VP's face was pale and shocked. Her perfect composure finally shattered. She didn't look at Sarah as the agents led her past the nurses' station, through the ER, toward the exit where a black sedan waited in the parking lot. Everyone stopped working to watch. Dr. Webb's mouth hung open. Jessica stared with wide eyes. And Luis Carter, who'd finally returned from wherever he'd been hiding, went completely white. The agents put Victoria in the back of the sedan and drove away. Colonel Voss appeared at Sarah's elbow. "That was fast," Sarah whispered. "Federal investigators have been watching this hospital for months," Voss said quietly. "They just needed someone on the inside to break the pattern. You were supposed to be their scapegoat, the expendable employee who took the fall while the real operation continued." She paused. "You weren't supposed to have friends in the military." Sarah's legs felt weak. "What happens now? Now they tear this place apart looking for evidence, bank records, pharmacy logs, security footage, everything." Voss met her eyes. "You're going to be cleared, publicly, completely. But it's going to get ugly first." Sarah nodded slowly. She looked around the ER, at the nurses whispering, at the doctors trying to process what they'd just witnessed, at Luis Carter standing frozen near the pharmacy terminal, with guilt written across his face. The woman they'd thrown away was about to become the reason everything came crashing down. And Sarah Mitchell realized with cold clarity that this was only the beginning. Luis Carter bolted. Sarah saw him move, saw the exact moment panic overrode whatever thin veneer of calm he'd been maintaining. And then he was running toward the back exit near the loading docks. His sneakers squeaked against the tile. A chart clattered to the floor. 2 nurses jumped out of his way. Colonel Voss didn't even flinch. She spoke into her radio with the same tone someone might use to order coffee. "Runner heading east through the loading area. Secure him." 2 soldiers appeared at the back exit before Luis reached it. He skidded to a stop, looked left, looked right, found nothing but walls and military personnel, and the sudden awful realization that he'd just made everything infinitely worse for himself. "Don't move," one of the soldiers said. Luis raised his hand slowly. Sarah watched them walk him back through the ER, his face drained of color, his eyes darting around like he was searching for an escape route that didn't exist. When he passed the nurses' station, he looked directly at her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Sarah said nothing. What was there to say? Sorry didn't fix the destroyed career, didn't erase the humiliation, didn't undo the hours she'd spent wondering if she'd actually gone insane and stolen medication without remembering. Sorry was just noise. The soldiers escorted Luis out through the main entrance. Dr. Webb stood near the central desk, his face pale and slack. "What the hell is happening?" "Justice," Voss said. "Finally." She walked away before Webb could ask anything else. Sarah stayed where she was, her hands still resting on the counter, her brain struggling to process the past 12 hours. Fired. Vindicated. Watched her accuser get arrested. Watched her actual thief get caught running. It felt unreal, like she'd stepped sideways into some alternate version of her life where things actually worked the way they were supposed to. Jessica appeared at her elbow, eyes red from crying. "Did you know?" "Know what?" "That Victoria was dirty, that Luis was stealing." Sarah shook her head. "I saw Luis take the medication once, that's all. Once was enough." Jessica wiped her eyes. "He's been doing it for months. Everyone knew the logs were wrong, but nobody wanted to say anything because Victoria always shut down complaints. She made it clear that if you caused problems, you'd be gone. So everyone just stayed quiet. What else were we supposed to do?" Jessica's voice cracked. "This is the only hospital in 50 miles. If we lost our jobs here, we'd have to move. Some of us have kids in school, mortgages. We couldn't just—" She stopped. "I know that sounds like an excuse." "It is an excuse," Sarah said, not unkindly. "But I get it." Jessica nodded and walked away, her shoulders hunched like she was carrying something heavy. Sarah understood that weight. She'd carried it herself in different forms, in different places. The burden of knowing something was wrong and being powerless to fix it. The slow erosion of integrity that came from working in broken systems. The exhaustion that made people choose survival over righteousness. She didn't blame Jessica. She was just tired of being the person who paid for everyone else's cowardice. The morning dragged forward. Federal agents moved through the hospital like ants through a colony, opening doors, examining computers, interviewing staff. Sarah gave her statement 3 separate times to 3 different people, each conversation a variation of the same questions. What did you see? When did you see it? Did anyone else witness this? Are you sure? Are you certain? How do you know? By noon, her throat was raw from talking. By 2 in the afternoon, she was sitting in an empty break room drinking terrible coffee and trying to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a witness. Voss found her there. The colonel sat down across from Sarah without asking, her expression unreadable. "You holding up?" Voss asked. "Define holding up." "Still breathing, still coherent, not currently punching walls." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Then yeah, I'm holding up." Voss pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. On the screen was a financial document, bank transfers, numbered accounts, timestamps going back 18 months. Victoria Brennan was running a prescription diversion scheme, Voss said. Medications stolen from the hospital pharmacy were sold to distributors out of state. Luis Carter was one of 4 nurses participating. They falsified logs, altered time stamps, and framed anyone who got too close to noticing the pattern. Sarah stared at the numbers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through accounts she didn't recognize. How long have you known? Sarah asked. 3 months? FBI got a tip from a buyer who wanted a deal on unrelated charges. They've been watching Riverside General since January, building the case, waiting for enough evidence to make arrests stick. Voss paused. Then you showed up on the radar 2 weeks ago when Victoria started the termination process. So I was just bait. No. You were going to be collateral damage. Voss took her phone back. The FBI wanted to wait longer before moving, build an airtight case. But I told them if they let you take the fall for this, I'd make their lives very difficult. Turns out a colonel making noise about federal corruption investigations tends to accelerate timelines. Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. You did that for me? You kept my soldiers alive when half of them should have died. Yeah, Mitchell, I did that for you. The break room door opened. Agent Rodriguez stepped inside, his expression neutral. Ms. Mitchell, we need you to come with us. Sarah's stomach dropped. Why? We have more questions. I already told you everything. Not about the theft. Rodriguez glanced at Voss. About the hospital itself. Sarah followed the agents to a conference room on the 3rd floor that had been converted into a temporary command center. Laptops covered the table. Documents spread across every available surface. A whiteboard on the wall showed names and connections drawn in different colored markers. A spiderweb of corruption that extended far beyond Victoria Brennan and Louise Carter. Rodriguez gestured for Sarah to sit. She did, her pulse hammering in her ears. How long have you worked at Riverside General? Rodriguez asked. 10 years, since I left the Army. And during that time, did you ever notice irregularities beyond the medication theft? Sarah frowned. What kind of irregularities? Billing discrepancies? Patient records being altered? Staff complaints disappearing? Anything that seemed off. Sarah thought about it. Thought about the time she'd flagged duplicate charges on patient bills only to have them dismissed. The incident reports she'd filed that never went anywhere. The colleague who'd raised concerns about infection rates in the ICU and suddenly found herself transferred to night shift in the psychiatric ward. Yeah, Sarah said slowly, there were things. Tell us. So she did. She talked for 2 hours, dredging up memories she'd tried to forget, connecting dots she hadn't realized formed a pattern. The more she spoke, the more the agents wrote, and the more Sarah understood that what she'd witnessed wasn't just a few bad employees stealing medication. It was systemic. Rodriguez finally closed his laptop. Miss Mitchell, we're going to need you to testify. Testify where? Federal court. This isn't just about theft anymore. We're looking at Medicare fraud, insurance fraud, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy. Multiple executives are implicated. If we can prove they knowingly participated in this scheme, we're talking about prison sentences, not fines. Sarah's mouth went dry. I'm just a nurse. You're a witness. A credible one. You have no financial stake in this hospital, no reason to lie, and a military record that makes you hard to discredit. Juries like that. I can't. Sarah stopped. I don't want to be the person who takes down an entire hospital. You're not. They did that to themselves. Rodriguez stood. We'll be in touch. The agents left. Sarah sat alone in this conference room, surrounded by evidence of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. She felt sick, angry, exhausted beyond measure. The door opened again. Dr. Webb stepped inside, closing it behind him. Sarah tensed. Webb looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot. His normally neat hair stuck up in odd angles. He held a folder in his hands like it was something fragile. I owe you an apology, Webb said. You don't owe me anything. I do. Webb set the folder on the table. I knew something was wrong, not the specifics, but enough. The missing medications, the altered logs, Victoria's pattern of firing anyone who asked too many questions. I knew, and I didn't say anything. Why not? Webb laughed bitterly. Because I'm a coward. Because I have student loans and a mortgage and a reputation to protect. Because it was easier to keep my head down and assume someone else would eventually fix it. He pushed the folder toward her. This is my resignation. I'm submitting it to the board this afternoon. Sarah opened the folder, read the letter inside. It was formal and brief and brutally honest about Webb's failures as the ER chief. You don't have to do this, Sarah said. Yeah, I do. Because if I don't, I'll spend the rest of my career wondering if I'm actually a doctor or just someone who wears a white coat and collects a paycheck? Webb headed for the door, paused with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, you're the best nurse I've ever worked with. I should have said that before. I should have defended you. He left before Sarah could respond. She sat there holding his resignation letter and feeling something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness. Webb didn't deserve that yet, might never deserve it, but recognition. The acknowledgement that not everyone who failed her had done it out of malice. Some people were just weak. Some people broke under pressure. Some people chose self-preservation over righteousness and had to live with that choice. Sarah wasn't sure which was worse. The day bled into evening. The hospital slowly returned to normal operations, or whatever passed for normal now that federal agents were stationed in the hallways and everyone knew their employers were going to prison. Sarah's shift technically ended at 6, but she stayed, helping cover for nurses who'd called in sick and staff who'd quit during the chaos. She was restocking a supply closet when Jessica found her. "There's someone here to see you," Jessica said. "Who?" "He won't say, but he's military." Sarah followed Jessica back to the ER entrance. A man in his 50s stood near the automatic doors, wearing an army dress uniform with medals Sarah recognized, even from a distance. Combat Infantryman Badge, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. This was someone who'd seen the worst of it and survived. The man turned when he saw her. Sarah's heart stopped. Sergeant Major Tom Halstead. She hadn't seen him in 6 years. Not since the medical convoy ambush outside Kandahar, where she'd spent 40 minutes keeping him alive with nothing but pressure and prayer while insurgents fired at them from the hills. He'd lost his left leg below the knee that day. Sarah had saved the rest of him. "Mitchell," Halstead said, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah crossed the space between them and hugged him hard. Halstead hugged back, his grip strong despite the years and the injury and everything he'd survived since they'd last seen each other. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked. "Voss called me. Told me you were in trouble. Thought you might need some backup." Halstead gestured at his uniform. "I'm stationed at Fort Hamilton now, recruiting office. Not as exciting as the old days, but the leg doesn't work so well for field ops anymore." Sarah laughed through tears. "You didn't have to come." "The hell I didn't. You saved my life. That means I show up when you need me. No questions asked." More soldiers started arriving. Not a few, dozens. They came through the hospital entrance one by one, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, some using canes or wheelchairs or prosthetics. Young men and women who'd served in different wars, different conflicts, different eras, but they all had one thing in common. Sarah had treated them. In field hospitals. In combat zones. In places where the line between life and death was measured in minutes, and the only thing standing between a soldier and oblivion was a nurse who refused to give up. They filled the ER waiting room, quiet and respectful, their presence a silent declaration of loyalty. Colonel Voss appeared at Sarah's side. "I made a few calls," Voss said simply. Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process the fact that these people, these soldiers who'd moved on with their lives, who'd left the military and started families and built careers, had dropped everything to come stand with her. A young woman approached, maybe 25, with scars on her arms and a Purple Heart pin on her jacket. "You pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Ramadi," the woman said. "I was 19, scared out of my mind. You stayed with me the whole time, kept talking to me, wouldn't let me pass out even when I wanted to. I'm a nurse now because of you." An older man stepped forward. "You set my broken arm during a sandstorm when we couldn't evacuate. Did it without anesthesia because we'd run out. Hurt like hell, but you talked me through it." Another voice. "You did CPR on me for 20 minutes after an IED blast. Doc said I was dead. You didn't care." More stories, more voices, a chorus of gratitude and respect that washed over Sarah like a wave. She'd saved all of them, and now they were here to save her. Victoria Brennan's attorney arrived at 8 in the evening, a sharp-dressed man with expensive shoes, and the kind of confidence that came from winning cases for people who deserved to lose. He set up in a consultation room and started making calls, arranging bail, coordinating with other lawyers representing the hospital executives who'd been arrested. Sarah watched through the window as he worked. "He's going to try to make you look bad," Voss said quietly. "That's how defense attorneys operate. They'll dig into your history, find anything questionable, twist it to make the jury doubt your testimony. There's nothing to find. There's always something. A bad performance review, a patient complaint, a supervisor who didn't like you. They'll manufacture doubt where none exists. Sarah's jaw tightened. Let them try. The attorney emerged from the consultation room an hour later, spotted Sarah standing near the nurse's station, and walked directly toward her. Ms. Mitchell, he said, his voice smooth. My name is Richard Kaufman. I represent Victoria Brennan. I'd like to have a conversation. I'm not interested. I think you should be. My client maintains her innocence. She believes you've been manipulated by federal investigators who are looking for a scapegoat to justify their overreach. Sarah laughed. Your client was arrested for fraud. Alleged fraud. Nothing has been proven in court. Kaufman pulled out a business card. If you're willing to reconsider your testimony, my client is prepared to offer compensation for your inconvenience. You're trying to bribe me. I'm trying to ensure justice is served fairly. Sarah took the card, looked at it, then tore it in half. Get out of my hospital, she said. Kaufman's smile never wavered. This is going to get very ugly, Ms. Mitchell. You should think carefully about what you're willing to sacrifice. He left before she could respond. Voss appeared at her shoulder. That was a threat. I know. He's going to come at you hard during trial, attack your credibility, make you look unstable. I know that too. And you're still going to testify. Sarah met Voss's eyes. Yeah, I am. Because the alternative was letting Victoria and Louise and everyone who'd participated in this corruption walk away unpunished. The alternative was accepting that some people were above accountability, that power and money and expensive lawyers could override truth. Sarah had spent too long watching bad people win. Not this time. The night stretched on. Most of the soldiers eventually left, promising to return if Sarah needed them. Halstead stayed camping out in the waiting room like a protective older brother. Voss coordinated with military police and federal agents. The hospital slowly emptied as visiting hours ended and only essential staff remained. Sarah found herself alone in the break room again, drinking more terrible coffee, staring at nothing. The door opened. Louise Carter's wife stood in the doorway. Sarah recognized her from the hospital Christmas parties, a quiet woman named Maria who worked as an elementary school teacher and always seemed slightly overwhelmed by the chaos of hospital social events. Maria's eyes were red from crying. I'm sorry to bother you, Maria said quietly. I know you probably don't want to see me. What do you want? Maria stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I wanted you to know that I didn't know about what Luis was doing. I swear I didn't know. Sarah said nothing. He told me tonight, Maria continued, her voice breaking, after they arrested him. He told me everything. The stealing, the lying, framing you. And I just... She wiped her eyes. I don't know what to do. We have 2 kids, a mortgage. I teach 3rd grade and barely make $30,000 a year. If Luis goes to prison, I don't know how we'll survive. Sarah wanted to feel sympathy, wanted to care about this woman's situation, about the children who were about to lose their father, about the family that was falling apart. But all she felt was tired. That's not my problem, Sarah said. I know it's not. But I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that if I could change what he did, I would. Your apology doesn't fix anything. Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I needed to say it. She left. Sarah sat alone with the weight of someone else's broken family and wondered when exactly she'd become the kind of person who couldn't summon empathy for collateral damage. Maybe it had happened overseas, watching civilians pay for wars they didn't start. Maybe it had happened here, watching her own life get destroyed by people who knew better. Either way, she was too empty to care anymore. 3 a.m. arrived with the kind of eerie quiet that only existed in hospitals during graveyard shifts. Sarah was finishing paperwork when Agent Rodriguez found her again. We have a problem, he said. Sarah looked up. What kind of problem? Victoria Brennan made bail 2 hours ago. Already? I thought fraud charges... Her attorney argued she wasn't a flight risk. Judge agreed. She's out pending trial. Rodriguez's expression was grim, and her first call after posting bail was to the hospital board of directors. Sarah's blood went cold. What did she tell them? That you're a disgruntled employee making false accusations to cover your own theft, that the federal investigation is based on fabricated evidence, That if the board doesn't publicly distance themselves from you and the charges, she'll sue them for wrongful termination and defamation. That's insane. That's strategy. She's trying to isolate you, make you toxic so nobody wants to be associated with your testimony. If she can turn you into the villain, the whole case gets harder to prosecute. Sarah stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. So what do? We keep building the case. We gather more evidence. We prepare for trial. Rodriguez paused. But I need to warn you. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Victoria has money, connections, and a team of lawyers who are very good at their jobs. They're going to make your life hell. Let them. Rodriguez studied her for a long moment. You're not going to break, are you? No, Sarah said. I'm really not. The agent left. Sarah walked through the empty hospital, her footsteps echoing against tile, past darkened rooms and sleeping patients and nurses stationed at their desks. She ended up on the roof, a place she'd discovered years ago when the pressure of overnight shifts became too much and she needed air. The city spread below her, lights flickering in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd been so sure that truth would be enough, that once Victoria was exposed, once the evidence came out, everything would resolve itself cleanly. But nothing was clean. Victoria was free. Luis was out on bail too, probably. The hospital board was more concerned with liability than justice, and Sarah was left holding the pieces of a case that might fall apart before it ever reached a courtroom. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through news articles that had already started appearing. Riverside General Hospital, under federal investigation. Nurse claims. Wrongful termination in medication. Theft, scandal hospital, VP arrested, released on bail. The comment sections were brutal. People calling Sarah a liar, a thief, an attention seeker. Others defending her, citing her military service, questioning why the hospital had fired her so quickly. The internet had turned her life into entertainment, debating her credibility like she was a character in a TV show instead of a real person whose career hung in the balance. Sarah closed the browser and pocketed her phone. The roof door opened behind her. Colonel Voss emerged, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Figured I'd find you up here, Voss said, handing her a cup. Sarah took it gratefully. Can't sleep. Nobody sleeps the night after their life explodes. Voss leaned against the railing beside her. I've been through 3 deployments and 2 congressional investigations. Take it from me, the waiting is worse than the fighting. How long until trial? 6 months. Maybe longer if Victoria's lawyers stall. 6 months of living in limbo. 6 months of not knowing if she'd be vindicated or destroyed. 6 months of watching her name get dragged through media and courtrooms and public opinion. I can't do this for 6 months, Sarah said quietly. Yes, you can, because you don't have a choice. Voss sipped her coffee. But you also don't have to do it alone. Those soldiers who showed up tonight, they meant it. You need something, you call. You need someone to stand with you in court. We'll fill the gallery. You need a place to stay because reporters are camped outside your apartment. You've got 20 offers. Sarah's throat tightened. Why? Because you didn't leave us behind when it would have been easier, so we're not leaving you behind now. They stood in silence, watching the sun begin to rise over the city. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You should have taken the deal when you had the chance. This is your last warning. She showed the screen to Voss. The colonel's expression went hard. Forward that to Rodriguez. That's witness intimidation, federal crime. Sarah forwarded the text, then blocked the number. More messages started coming in. Different numbers, same basic threat. Drop the charges, stop cooperating, walk away or else. Voss pulled out her own phone and made a call. I need protective detail on Sarah Mitchell. Yes, right now. Someone just threatened a federal witness. Sarah felt numb watching Voss coordinate security like this was normal, like people threatening her life was just another Tuesday in the disaster that her existence had become. The sun continued rising, indifferent to human drama, and somewhere in the city below, Victoria Brennan was planning her next move. Victoria's lawyer filed a countersuit 72 hours later. Sarah learned about it from a reporter who ambushed her in the hospital parking lot at 6 a.m, shoving a microphone in her face before she'd even had coffee. Ms. Mitchell, how do you respond to allegations that you fabricated evidence against Victoria Brennan? Do you have any comment on the defamation lawsuit? Sarah pushed past without answering, her heart hammering, her hand shaking so badly she dropped her keys twice before getting the car door open. She sat behind the wheel, watching the reporter film her through the windshield, documenting her panic for whatever news segment would air that evening. Her phone rang. Rodriguez. "Tell me you didn't know about the countersuit," Sarah said. "We knew she'd try something. Didn't expect it this fast." Rodriguez sounded tired. "It's an intimidation tactic. She's suing you for $10 million in damages, claiming you orchestrated a conspiracy to destroy her career and reputation." "With what money? I'm a nurse." "Doesn't matter. The point isn't to win. The point is to bury you in legal fees and stress until you break." He paused. "Do you have a lawyer?" "No." "Get one. Today. I'll send you names of attorneys who handle this kind of case." The call ended. Sarah sat in her car, watching the reporter finally give up and leave, and felt the full weight of what she'd walked into. This wasn't just about testifying anymore. Victoria was coming for her life, her savings, her sanity, her ability to exist without looking over her shoulder. She drove to the hospital anyway because what else was she supposed to do? Hide? Run? Let Victoria win by default? The security detail Voss had arranged met her at the entrance, 2 military police officers who looked like they could bench press a Humvee. They escorted her through the building in silence, their presence drawing stares and whispers from staff who were already gossiping about the federal investigation. Sarah changed into her scrubs and reported for her shift. The ER was different now, colder. People who'd worked alongside her for years suddenly found reasons to be busy when she walked into a room. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Nobody made eye contact. She was radioactive. Jessica was the only one who approached her, and even that came with obvious discomfort. "The board sent out a memo," Jessica said quietly. "They're putting you on administrative leave pending an internal investigation." Sarah's jaw tightened. "When?" "End of your shift today." They waited until Victoria filed her lawsuit. Jessica nodded miserably. "I'm sorry. I know this is—" "Don't," Sarah cut her off. "Don't apologize for something you can't control." She walked away before Jessica could say anything else. The shift dragged on with the weight of inevitability pressing down on her shoulders. Every patient she treated felt like it might be the last. Every procedure she performed felt like evidence that would be used against her later. By noon, she was exhausted from the effort of pretending everything was fine when her entire world was actively disintegrating. She was restocking supplies when Dr. Webb found her. He looked like he hadn't slept since submitting his resignation. Eyes hollow, face gaunt, the kind of exhaustion that came from moral reckoning. "I talked to the board," Webb said. Sarah didn't look up. "Good for you." "I told them they were making a mistake, that suspending you was exactly what Victoria wants, that it makes you look guilty when you're not." "What did they say?" Webb's silence was answer enough. Sarah slammed the supply cabinet shut. "They don't care. They care about liability and insurance and not getting sued into bankruptcy. I'm collateral damage. I'm trying to help. You're 3 months too late for that." Sarah finally looked at him. "You want to help? Testify. Tell the truth about what you saw. Put your reputation on the line the way mine is." Webb flinched. "I can't." "Then get out of my way." He left. Sarah finished her shift in mechanical silence, treating patients with the same competence she'd always had while her mind calculated how many months of mortgage payments she had saved and how long she could survive without income, and whether she'd have to sell her car or her furniture first. At 3 o'clock, the hospital administrator delivered her suspension notice personally. Gerald Hoffman was a bureaucrat in an expensive suit, the kind of man who'd built a career on avoiding conflict and protecting institutions. He handed Sarah the paperwork with the expression of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary task. "This is precautionary," Hoffman said, "until the legal matters are resolved." "You're firing me again." "We're suspending you with pay." "You're firing me." Sarah refused to touch the papers. "Just say it." Hoffman set the paperwork on the counter between them. "You're suspended pending investigation. You'll be notified when you can return to work." "If I can return." Hoffman didn't deny it. Sarah picked up the suspension notice, read it once, then walked out of Riverside General Hospital for the second time in a week, this time with security trailing her and administrative staff watching her leave like she was contagious. The military police drove her home. Her apartment building was surrounded by news vans. "You've got to be kidding me," Sarah muttered. One of the MPs, a woman named Corporal Davis spoke into her radio. Need additional support at Mitchell's residence. Media presence. Reinforcements arrived in 10 minutes. More military police. Colonel Voss and Sergeant Major Halstead, who took one look at the reporters camping outside Sarah's building and started physically moving them back with the kind of authority that came from decades of ordering people around. "This is harassment," Halstead announced to the crowd. "You're interfering with a federal witness. I suggest you leave before this becomes a criminal matter." The reporters didn't leave, but they backed up, still filming, still shouting questions that Sarah ignored as she was escorted through the gauntlet into her building. Her apartment was small and lived in. Military photographs on the walls, nursing textbooks on shelves, the accumulated debris of a life built slowly after coming home from war. It had always felt like sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage. Voss did a security sweep while the MPs checked windows and exits. Sarah stood in her living room feeling like a stranger in her own space. "You can't stay here," Voss said finally. "Too exposed, too easy to access." "I'm not letting them drive me out of my own home. It's not about letting them do anything. It's about staying alive." Voss pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a series of text messages. More threats. More variations of drop the charges or else. These escalated from warnings to actual threats in the past 6 hours. Someone sent a detailed description of your apartment layout. They know which window is your bedroom. They know your car. They're not playing anymore. Sarah's hands went cold. "You think Victoria would actually—" "I think desperate people do desperate things. And Victoria Brennan is looking at 20 years in federal prison. That makes her very desperate." Voss pocketed her phone. "Pack a bag. You're staying on base at Fort Hamilton until trial." "I'm not military anymore." "No, but I am. And I'm invoking emergency protective measures for a federal witness under credible threat." "You're coming with me." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle herself, that she'd survived war zones and didn't need protection from some corrupt hospital administrator and her hired thugs. But the truth was, she was scared. Not of testifying, not of the trial, but of dying in her sleep because she'd underestimated how far people would go to protect themselves. She packed. She eats. Corporal Davis drove her to Fort Hamilton while Voss followed in a separate vehicle. The base was 40 minutes outside the city, surrounded by fences and gates, and the kind of security that made civilian threats irrelevant. Sarah was processed through visitor protocols, assigned temporary quarters in the bachelor officer housing, and given a security detail that would accompany her anywhere she went. The room was sterile. Bed, desk, bathroom, nothing else. It felt like being deployed again, living in a space designed for function, not comfort. Sarah unpacked mechanically and tried not to think about how her life had become unrecognizable in less than a week. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hiding won't save you." She forwarded it to Rodriguez and blocked the sender. Another text arrived immediately from a different number. "They'll find you eventually." Sarah turned off her phone. The next 2 weeks blurred into a nightmare routine of lawyers and depositions and pretrial motions. Rodriguez and his team built their case, while Victoria's lawyers launched attack after attack, filing motion after motion to suppress evidence and discredit witnesses. Sarah spent hours in conference rooms answering the same questions over and over, watching her words get twisted into statements she'd never made. Victoria's defense strategy became clear fast. Paint Sarah as a disgruntled employee with a vendetta, someone who'd manufactured evidence because she couldn't accept being fired for legitimate reasons. They dug up every negative performance review Sarah had ever received, found a patient complaint from 3 years ago where someone claimed she'd been rude during intake, located a former supervisor who was willing to testify that Sarah had always been difficult to work with. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter in legal combat. Sarah's lawyer, a fierce woman named Patricia Ramos, who specialized in whistleblower cases, fought back hard, filing her own motions, deposing hospital staff, uncovering more evidence of the fraud scheme. But every victory came with setbacks. Every piece of evidence they produced, Victoria's team found a way to challenge. The trial date was set for October, 5 months away. Sarah existed in limbo, living on base, unable to work, watching her savings drain as legal fees mounted despite Ramos's reduced rate. The soldiers at Fort Hamilton were supportive, bringing her food, inviting her to join activities, treating her like one of their own. But Sarah felt isolated in ways that went beyond physical distance. She was fighting alone, and everyone knew it. June arrived with humidity and heat. Sarah was running laps around the base track, her only outlet for the rage and helplessness burning through her system, when Halstead found her. "Got news," he said without preamble. Luis Carter flipped. Sarah stopped running, breathing hard. "What?" "The FBI offered him a deal, reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against Victoria and the other executives. He took it." Halstead handed her a bottle of water. "He's cooperating fully. Names, dates, amounts, everything." Sarah drank, her mind racing. "What does that mean for the trial?" "Means the federal case just got a lot stronger. Means Victoria's lawyers are going to come at you even harder because you're now the secondary threat instead of the primary one. They'll try to discredit you to create reasonable doubt about Luis's testimony." "So nothing changes?" "Everything changes. But yeah, you're still in the crosshairs." They walked back toward the housing unit in silence. Sarah's phone, which she'd started keeping on again despite the constant threats, buzzed with a call from Rodriguez. "Did Halstead tell you?" Rodriguez asked. "Yeah. We need to prep you for what's coming. Victoria's team is going to argue that Luis was coerced into testifying, that his deal with the FBI makes him unreliable. They're going to use your military background against you." Sarah frowned. "How?" "They'll suggest you have PTSD, that your judgment is impaired, that you have a pattern of seeing conspiracies where none exist. It's offensive and it's bullshit, but it'll plant doubt in jurors' minds." "I don't have PTSD." "Doesn't matter. The accusation is enough." Rodriguez paused. "Have you ever sought mental health treatment, therapy, counseling?" "After I came back from my third deployment, yeah. Standard debriefing stuff. They're going to subpoena those records." Sarah's stomach dropped. "That's confidential." "Not in a case like this. They'll argue it's relevant to your credibility as a witness." Rodriguez's voice was gentle. "I need to know what's in those records, Sarah. I need to know what they're going to find." Sarah closed her eyes. "I had trouble sleeping, some anxiety. Took me about 6 months to adjust to civilian life. The therapist said I was fine, just needed time to decompress." "Anything about paranoia, trust issues, anger management?" "No, nothing like that." "Good. We can work with that." Rodriguez exhaled. "Trial starts in 4 months. Between now and then, you need to be perfect. No outbursts, no social media, no interviews, nothing they can use to make you look unstable." "I'm not unstable." "I know, but we need the jury to know that too." The call ended. Sarah stood on the track under the summer sun and wondered how much more of herself she'd have to sacrifice before this was over. July brought a heat wave and new complications. The hospital board released a statement distancing themselves from both Victoria and Sarah, claiming they'd had no knowledge of any fraudulent activity and were cooperating fully with federal investigators. It was corporate speak for, "We're protecting ourselves and throwing everyone else under the bus." 2 more nurses were arrested for participating in the medication theft scheme. The media coverage intensified. Sarah's face appeared on news broadcasts and newspaper articles. Her military service photo circulated alongside headlines that ranged from "Whistleblower nurse fights corruption" to "Hospital employees vendetta exposed." Public opinion split down the middle. Half the country saw her as a hero standing up to systemic corruption. The other half saw her as a disgruntled employee destroying innocent people's lives with false accusations. Sarah stopped reading the news. She focused on preparation instead. Ramos drilled her on testimony, teaching her how to answer hostile questions without getting defensive, how to stay calm under cross-examination, how to present facts without emotion. "They're going to try to break you," Ramos said during one particularly brutal practice session. "They're going to bring up every mistake you've ever made, every moment of weakness, every time you were human instead of perfect. And you're going to sit there and take it without reacting." "Why?" "But she does, because if you react, you look guilty. If you get angry, you look unstable. If you cry, you look manipulative." Ramos leaned forward. "The jury needs to see someone credible and calm, someone who tells the truth without embellishment. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, even though her hands were shaking under the table. August arrived with a call from Jessica Park. "I'm testifying," Jessica said without greeting. "I told the FBI everything I saw. About Victoria's threats, about the culture of fear at the hospital, about how everyone knew something was wrong, but nobody wanted to be the one to speak up. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. Why now? Because you shouldn't have to do this alone. And because I'm tired of being a coward. Jessica's voice shook. I know it doesn't fix what I didn't do before, but maybe it helps now. Other hospital staff started coming forward after that. A lab technician who'd noticed discrepancies in medication inventory. An administrator who'd been told to alter billing records. A pharmacist who'd raised concerns and been threatened with termination. The case against Victoria and the hospital executives grew stronger with each new witness. But so did the attacks against Sarah. Someone leaked her therapy records to the media. The headlines were brutal. Whistleblower nurse treated for anxiety and sleep disorders. Military veterans' mental health history raises questions. Never mind that the record showed standard post-deployment adjustment. Never mind that the therapist had concluded Sarah was healthy and functional. The narrative was set. Sarah Mitchell was mentally unstable and therefore unreliable. Ramos filed a lawsuit against the media outlet that published the confidential records, but the damage was done. Sarah stopped leaving the base entirely except for legal meetings. She ran laps until her legs gave out and lifted weights, until her arms trembled and did everything possible to exhaust herself enough to sleep without nightmares. The soldiers at Fort Hamilton watched her destroy herself slowly and didn't comment, recognizing the signs of someone fighting a battle nobody else could see. Voss found her in the base gym at 2 a.m, working through her third set of deadlift. You need to rest, Voss said. Sarah didn't stop. I'm fine. You're not. You're burning out. Voss waited until Sarah finished her set. When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours? Don't remember. When was the last time you ate a full meal? Sarah set down the barbell. What do you want me to do, Elena? Pretend everything's fine? Act like my life isn't falling apart? I want you to survive long enough to win. Voss crossed her arms. Because if you collapse before trial, Victoria wins. If you show up looking exhausted and unstable, her lawyers will use that against you. You need to take care of yourself. I don't know how to do that anymore. The admission hung in the air between them. Voss's expression softened. Yeah, I know that feeling. They sat together on the gym floor, two veterans who'd spent too much of their lives in crisis mode and didn't talk about anything important. Sometimes that was enough. September arrived with pre-trial hearings. Sarah sat in a federal courtroom for the first time, watching lawyers argue motions and procedural issues that would determine what evidence could be presented at trial. Victoria sat at the defense table looking composed and professional, her expensive suit and perfect hair a stark contrast to Sarah's simple dress and exhaustion. Their eyes met once across the courtroom. Victoria smiled. It wasn't friendly, it was predatory. The smile of someone who thought they were going to win and wanted their opponent to know it. Sarah looked away first, hating herself for it. The judge ruled on several motions that day. Some went in the prosecution's favor, others went to the defense. By the time the hearing ended, both sides had won and lost enough that nobody could predict the trial's outcome. Ramos pulled Sarah aside in the courthouse hallway. They're going to offer you a deal, Ramos said. What kind of deal? Victoria's team will approach you through back channels, offer you money to recant your testimony, claim you were mistaken about what you saw, suggest the FBI pressured you. Ramos met her eyes. You need to refuse immediately and report the contact to Rodriguez. Any hesitation will be used against you. I'm not taking a deal. Good. Because I didn't work this hard to watch you fold now. The offer came 3 days later. Not from Victoria's lawyers, but from a former coworker, someone Sarah had considered a friend before all this started. They met at a coffee shop near the base, neutral territory. The conversation casual at first. Then the friend said, Victoria wanted me to reach out. She thinks there's been a misunderstanding. She's willing to drop her countersuit against you and pay for your legal fees if you're willing to admit you might have been wrong about what you saw that night. Sarah's coffee went cold in her hands. She sent you to bribe me. She sent me to offer you a way out. You could walk away from all this, go back to nursing, rebuild your life. By lying. By acknowledging that memory is fallible and you were under extreme stress, and maybe you didn't see what you thought you saw. The friend leaned forward. Sarah, this trial is going to destroy you. Even if you win, You'll never work in healthcare again. Your name will always be associated with this scandal. Is that really worth it?" Sarah stood up. "Yeah, it is." She reported the contact to Rodriguez 20 minutes later. He filed charges for witness tampering the same day. Victoria's former friend was arrested and agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. The walls were closing in on Victoria, and everyone could see it, but the hospital administrator wasn't done fighting. 2 weeks before trial, someone tried to run Sarah off the road. She was driving back to base after a legal meeting when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled alongside her on the highway. For a moment, Sarah thought it was just traffic. Then the SUV swerved hard into her lane, forcing her toward the shoulder. Sarah hit the brakes and jerked the wheel right. Her car fishtailed. The SUV accelerated and came at her again, this time from behind, ramming her bumper hard enough to send her spinning across 2 lanes. She managed to control the spin and pulled onto the shoulder, her heart hammering, her hands locked on the steering wheel. The SUV kept driving. Sarah called 911 with shaking fingers and reported the incident. State police arrived within minutes, took her statement, examined the damage to her car. They found paint transfer from the SUV on her bumper, but no plates, no identifying features, nothing that could be traced. "Could have been road rage," one officer suggested. "Or attempted murder," Sarah replied flatly. The military police who'd been following at a distance hadn't seen the SUV approach. It had come from a merge lane, perfectly positioned to look accidental. Rodriguez called her an hour later. "You're not driving yourself anywhere anymore. Military escort only." "This is insane." This is what happens when people are looking at decades in prison and decide witnesses are expendable. Rodriguez's voice was hard. "We're accelerating the trial date. Judge agreed to move it up to next week. We can't keep you safe indefinitely, and Victoria knows that. Time is on her side the longer this drags out." Sarah's car was towed to base for repairs. She spent the next week in lockdown, surrounded by security, preparing for trial with the knowledge that someone had just tried to kill her and might try again. The soldiers at Fort Hamilton responded by increasing patrols around her housing unit. Halstead personally checked her room for surveillance devices. Voss coordinated with federal marshals to ensure courthouse security. And Sarah tried not to think about the fact that she was living like a target because she'd refused to let corruption win. The night before trial, she couldn't sleep. She sat on her bed in the temporary housing unit, staring at the wall, running through testimony in her head, anticipating questions, preparing answers, trying not to imagine everything that could go wrong. A knock on her door. Voss stood outside holding 2 beers. "Thought you might need this," Voss said. They sat on Sarah's floor and drank in silence. "You ready?" Voss asked eventually. "No." "Good. Nobody who says they're ready for something like this is telling the truth." Voss finished her beer. "You're going to walk into that courthouse tomorrow and half the country is going to be watching. Victoria's lawyers are going to call you a liar. The media is going to analyze every word you say, and through all of it, you're going to tell the truth." "What if the truth isn't enough? Then we live with that. But at least we'll know we didn't back down." Sarah nodded slowly. "Thank you for all of this, for keeping me alive." "Don't thank me yet. Trial hasn't even started." Voss left. Sarah lay awake until dawn, watching the ceiling, counting down the hours until her life would either be vindicated or destroyed in a federal courtroom. The military convoy arrived at 6 a.m. to transport her downtown. 3 vehicles, armed escorts, radio coordination with courthouse security. They drove through the city like a presidential motorcade, past news vans and protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for Sarah and corruption has no place here, and Victoria Brennan is innocent." The courthouse steps were packed with cameras. Sarah walked through the crowd flanked by military police and federal marshals, her head up, her expression neutral. Reporters shouted questions she didn't answer. Cameras flashed. Someone threw something that bounced off a marshal's shoulder. Inside, the courthouse was quieter, but no less tense. Victoria was already seated at the defense table with her legal team, looking confident and composed. She didn't look at Sarah. Sarah took her seat behind the prosecution table and tried to keep her hands from shaking. The jury filed in. 12 people who would decide whether she was credible or delusional. 12 strangers who held her future in their hands. The judge entered. Everyone stood. "United States versus Victoria Brennan and others," the judge announced. "Are both sides ready to proceed?" The prosecution answered yes. The defense answered yes, and Sarah Mitchell realized there was no escape now. No way out. Nothing to do but sit in this courtroom and watch her life get dissected by lawyers who specialized in making truth look like lies. The judge turned to the prosecution. Call your first witness. Rodriguez stood. The United States calls Sarah Mitchell. Sarah walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they might give out any second. She was sworn in, sat down, looked at the jury. And before Rodriguez could ask his first question, Victoria's lead attorney stood up. Your Honor, the attorney said smoothly, before testimony begins, the defense has evidence that has just come to light. Evidence that fundamentally changes the nature of this case. The judge frowned. What evidence? Evidence that Ms. Mitchell was not, in fact, a reliable witness. Evidence that she had financial motivation to fabricate her testimony. The attorney held up a folder. We have bank records showing that Ms. Mitchell received $50,000 from an anonymous source 3 days before she first contacted the FBI with her accusations. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Sarah's vision tunneled. She heard nothing but white noise and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears because what the attorney was saying was impossible. She'd never received any money, never taken a bribe, never done anything except tell the truth. But the damage was done. The jury was staring at her with suspicion. The judge was ordering silence. And Victoria Brennan was smiling like she'd already won. Sarah's voice cut through the courtroom noise like a blade through flesh. That's a lie. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Ms. Mitchell, you'll have your opportunity to respond through your attorney. But Sarah was already standing, her hands gripping the witness stand rail so hard her knuckles went white. I never received any money, not $50,000, not 50 cents. That's fabricated evidence and you know it. Victoria's attorney, a man named Kaufman who'd tried to bribe her months ago, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just played a winning card. Your Honor, the bank records speak for themselves. We have documentation of a wire transfer to Ms. Mitchell's personal account on August 3rd. The transaction originated from an offshore account, and check the account number, Sarah interrupted. Read it out loud. Kaufman paused, glancing at the folder. The judge leaned forward. Read it, the judge ordered. Kaufman recited the account number slowly. Sarah pulled out her phone, technically not allowed in court, but nobody stopped her, and opened her banking app, held it up. That's not my account. My account number ends in 7739. That one ends in 7793. Someone created a fake account using my information. The courtroom went silent. Rodriguez was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, we need to examine this evidence. The defense clearly didn't verify. We verified everything, Kaufman snapped. The account is registered to Sarah Mitchell. Same social security number, same address. Then someone committed identity fraud, Sarah said flatly. Which is a federal crime, which means you just tried to introduce falsified evidence in a federal trial. The judge's expression went from annoyed to dangerous. Mr. Kaufman, approach the bench. Now. What followed was a whispered argument that lasted 5 minutes, while the jury watched and the gallery buzzed with speculation. Sarah stood at the witness stand, her heart hammering, her mind racing through the implications. Someone had created a fake bank account in her name and planted evidence to discredit her. Someone with resources and connections and enough desperation to commit multiple felonies. Victoria. It had to be Victoria. The judge finally spoke, his voice cold enough to frost the windows. This court will take a 30-minute recess while the prosecution and defense verify the authenticity of this evidence. Miss Mitchell, you may step down. Bailiff, secure that folder. The gavel struck. Sarah walked back to the prosecution table on shaky legs. Rodriguez grabbed her arm and pulled her into a side conference room where federal agents were already setting up laptops. That was either brilliant or insane, Rodriguez said. It was the truth. Let's prove it. He turned to one of the agents. Get her bank statements, cross-reference every transaction for the past year. Find out who opened that fake account and trace the money. The agents worked fast. Sarah sat in a chair watching numbers scroll across screens, watching her financial history get dissected, transaction by transaction. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Ramos appeared in his doorway. They're panicking. Kaufman is arguing with Victoria in the hallway. She's telling him to withdraw the evidence. He's telling her it's too late. Good, Rodriguez said without looking up. Let them panic. It took 20 minutes to confirm what Sarah already knew. The fake account had been opened 6 weeks ago using stolen identity documents. The wire transfer had come from a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, and the IP address used to set up the account traced back to a law firm in downtown, Victoria Brennan's law firm. Rodriguez looked at Sarah with something close to admiration. "How did you know?" "I didn't, but I know my own bank account." Sarah stood. "They got sloppy, changed one digit, and hoped nobody would check. They didn't expect you to have access to your phone in court. Their mistake." They walked back into the courtroom where the judge was waiting with an expression that could have curdled milk. Victoria sat at the defense table looking like someone had just informed her the building was on fire. Kaufman stood beside her, his confident demeanor replaced with something close to panic. The judge didn't wait for everyone to sit. "Mr. Kaufman, I've reviewed the evidence presented by the prosecution regarding the bank account in question. It appears the account was fraudulently created using Ms. Mitchell's stolen identity. Do you have anything to say?" Kaufman opened his mouth, closed it. "Your Honor, we were provided this evidence by whom?" Silence. The judge leaned forward. "Let me be very clear. If you tell me your client provided falsified evidence, I will hold her in contempt and refer this matter for criminal prosecution. If you tell me you fabricated this evidence yourself, I will disbar you and charge you with obstruction of justice. Either way, someone is going to answer for attempting to commit fraud in my courtroom." Kaufman looked at Victoria. Victoria stared straight ahead, her face pale. "We withdraw the evidence, Your Honor," Kaufman said quietly. "That's not good enough." The judge turned to Rodriguez. "I assume you'll be filing charges. Multiple charges, identity theft, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." Rodriguez's voice was steady. "We'll also be investigating who created that shell corporation and who authorized the wire transfer." The judge nodded. "Bailiff, remand Victoria Brennan into custody pending new charges. Bond is revoked." The courtroom erupted again. Victoria stood as federal marshals approached, her composure finally cracking. "This is a mistake. I had nothing to do with that account. Someone on my legal team must have—" "Save it for your attorney," the judge said, "who is no longer Mr. Kaufman, since he's about to be disbarred." They put handcuffs on Victoria in front of the jury, the gallery, the cameras that had somehow found their way inside despite courthouse rules. Her expensive suit and perfect hair meant nothing now. She was just another defendant being led away while her empire collapsed around her. Victoria's eyes found Sarah as the marshals walked her past the prosecution table. "You did this," Victoria hissed. "You destroyed everything." Sarah met her gaze without flinching. "No, you did that yourself." They took Victoria out through a side door. The judge dismissed the jury for the day and called both legal teams into chambers. Sarah sat alone at the prosecution table, feeling numb, feeling vindicated, feeling like she'd just survived something that should have killed her. Ramos sat down beside her. "That was the most insane thing I've ever seen in a courtroom, and I've been practicing law for 20 years. Is it over? The identity fraud charges? Just beginning. The original trial?" Ramos smiled. "Yeah, it's over. Victoria's legal team is going to withdraw. She'll plead out to avoid additional charges. And you just became the most credible witness in federal court history." Sarah closed her eyes. "I want to go home." "You will, soon." The legal proceedings took another 3 hours. Victoria's remaining attorneys formally withdrew from the case. Her co-defendants, the other hospital executives, immediately began negotiating plea deals. Luis Carter, who'd been waiting to testify, gave his statement to investigators instead of the jury. By evening, the entire conspiracy had collapsed. Rodriguez walked Sarah out of the courthouse surrounded by military police and federal marshals. The news crews were still there, still filming, but the narrative had shifted. Now they were calling her a hero again. Now they wanted to know how she'd caught the fraud attempt. Now they were demanding investigations into Victoria's legal team. Sarah ignored all of it and climbed into the armored vehicle that would take her back to base. Voss was waiting in the transport. "You know you just made legal history, right?" "I exposed a fake bank account." "You exposed a conspiracy to commit fraud in federal court that's going to be taught in law schools." Voss handed her a bottle of water. "How are you holding up?" Sarah drank instead of answering because she didn't know how to explain that she felt empty rather than triumphant. She'd won. Victoria was going to prison. The corruption was exposed. Justice was being served. But she was still exhausted and homeless and unemployed and living in military housing because someone had tried to kill her. Victory felt hollow. The next 48 hours moved like a fever dream. The FBI arrested 3 members of Victoria's legal team for conspiracy and evidence tampering. The fake shell corporation was traced back to a financial consultant who immediately flipped and provided testimony implicating Victoria in multiple fraud schemes beyond the hospital. Bank records showed Victoria had stolen over $2 million from Riverside General over 3 years. More hospital executives were arrested. The board of directors resigned en masse. The state medical board launched an investigation into every hospital in the region, looking for similar fraud patterns. And Sarah Mitchell became the face of whistleblower protection, the nurse who'd refused to back down even when everything was stacked against her. She hated it. The media attention was suffocating. Interview requests flooded in from national news programs. Publishers wanted to buy her story. Advocacy groups wanted her to speak at conferences. Everyone wanted a piece of the nurse who'd taken down hospital corruption. Sarah refused everything and stayed on base, hiding from the spotlight. A week after the trial collapsed, Riverside General Hospital issued a public statement. They offered Sarah her job back with full back pay, benefits, and a formal apology for wrongful termination. She read the statement on her phone while sitting in the base cafeteria and felt nothing but contempt. "You're not going back," Voss said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Good. You're better than that place." Sarah set down her phone. "I don't know what to do now. I can't go back to nursing, not at Riverside, not anywhere around here. My name is too public. Patients will recognize me. Staff will treat me different. I can't just pretend none of this happened and go back to normal." "Normal ended the day they fired you." Voss leaned back in her chair. "But that doesn't mean your career is over. Just means you need to rebuild it somewhere else." "Where?" "Wherever you want. You've got job offers from 6 different hospitals in 4 different states. The VA is offering you a position. 3 different military medical facilities want you for their civilian staff." Voss paused. "Or you could do something completely different. Teach, consult, start your own thing. You've got options, Mitchell. More than you had before." Sarah nodded slowly, trying to imagine a future that didn't involve looking over her shoulder or waiting for the next attack. Her phone buzzed, a text from Jessica Park. "The hospital is shutting down. Federal investigation found too many violations. They're transferring patients to other facilities. Riverside General is done." Sarah showed the message to Voss. "Damn," Voss said. "They really went scorched earth. People are going to lose their jobs. Nurses who had nothing to do with the fraud, support staff, janitors, everyone. That's not your fault." "Feels like it." Voss grabbed Sarah's phone and set it face down on the table. "Listen to me. You exposed a criminal conspiracy. You prevented more theft, more fraud, more patients being billed for fake procedures. Yes, people are losing their jobs, but they were working for a corrupt institution that was going to collapse eventually anyway. You just accelerated the timeline. Tell that to Jessica and the other nurses who believed me. I will, and I'll tell them they're better off finding new positions at hospitals that aren't run by criminals." Voss stood. "Stop carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. You did the right thing. Let the consequences be someone else's problem for once." She left. Sarah sat alone in the cafeteria, surrounded by soldiers eating lunch and having normal conversations about normal problems, and tried to remember what normal felt like. 2 weeks later, Victoria Brennan pleaded guilty to 19 federal charges, including fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. The plea deal required her to testify against her co-conspirators and forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity. She was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Sarah watched the sentencing hearing from a conference room at Fort Hamilton. The video feed showing Victoria standing before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, no longer the powerful hospital administrator, but just another convicted felon. The judge gave Victoria an opportunity to speak before sentencing. Victoria's voice was flat, defeated. "I made mistakes. I let greed override my judgment. I hurt people who trusted me. I have no excuse." It wasn't an apology. It was an admission of failure. The judge sentenced her without hesitation. 23 years. Victoria would be 70 years old before she was eligible for parole. Sarah turned off the video feed and sat in silence, waiting to feel satisfaction or vindication or anything other than tired. It didn't come. Luis Carter was sentenced the following week, 8 years in federal prison in exchange for his cooperation. The other nurses who'd participated received sentences ranging from 3 to 12 years. Hospital executives who'd knowingly participated in the fraud scheme got 15 to 20 years each. Riverside General Hospital declared bankruptcy and closed permanently. 300 staff members lost their jobs overnight. The building sat empty, a monument to corruption and consequence. Sarah received a formal vindication from the state medical board, clearing her record of any wrongdoing. She received a commendation from the FBI for her cooperation. She received a check from the hospital's bankruptcy proceedings, her share of recovered assets totaling $40,000 in back pay and damages. She deposited the money and didn't spend it. Money felt meaningless when your life had been turned inside out. September became October and then November. Sarah remained on base, caught in limbo between the person she'd been and whoever she was supposed to become. The soldiers treated her well, inviting her to join activities, including her in conversations, making sure she wasn't alone. But she felt like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. Halstead found her one evening on the track, running laps in the cold. "You can't hide here forever," he said, falling into step beside her. "I'm not hiding. You've been on base for 7 months. You turn down every job offer. You won't talk to reporters. You barely leave your room except to run or lift weights." Halstead kept pace easily despite the prosthetic leg. "That's hiding, Mitchell." Sarah didn't argue because he was right. They ran in silence for another lap before Halstead spoke again. "You know what helped me after I lost the leg? Realizing that surviving wasn't the same as living. I could sit around feeling sorry for myself, or I could figure out how to build a life with what I had left. I don't know how to do that. Neither did I, but I learned." Halstead slowed to a walk. "You saved my life in Kandahar. You saved a lot of lives. That doesn't stop mattering just because a hospital fired you. Find something that matters again, and do that." He left her alone on the track. Sarah stood in the cold November air, watching her breath fog in front of her, and realized he was right. She'd been surviving, but not living. Existing in a holding pattern, waiting for some external force to tell her what came next. Nobody was going to tell her. She had to decide for herself. That night, Sarah opened her laptop and started looking at job postings. Not in her region, that was poisoned now, but across the country. Trauma centers in different states, teaching positions at nursing schools, consulting roles with healthcare organizations that needed someone who understood hospital operations. She applied to 7 positions. 5 responded within a week. 3 offered interviews. One from a Level 1 trauma center in Denver offered her a position as their emergency department clinical coordinator. Leadership role. Better pay. New city where nobody knew her face or her history. Sarah accepted. The paperwork took 2 weeks to process. She gave notice to Voss, who wasn't surprised. "Denver's a good choice," Voss said. "Mountains, clean air, far enough away from this mess that you can actually start over. Thank you for keeping me alive. Thank you for being worth keeping alive." Voss handed her an envelope. "Letters of recommendation from me, Halstead, and half the soldiers you treated over the years. You'll need them for licensing and background checks." Sarah opened the envelope and found 20 pages of testimonials, detailed accounts of her competence, character, and courage, written by people who'd trusted her with their lives. She'd never read anything like it. "I don't deserve this," Sarah said quietly. "Yeah, you do. You just don't believe it yet." Voss clasped her shoulder. "You will eventually. Get out of here, Mitchell. Go build something worth having." Sarah packed her belongings, which fit into 2 duffel bags and a backpack, and left Fort Hamilton on a cold December morning. The soldiers she'd lived among for 7 months gathered to see her off. A small formation of people who understood what she'd been through because they'd survived their own versions of it. Halstead hugged her hard. "Don't be a stranger." "I won't." "And Mitchell?" He stepped back. "You did good. Remember that when things get hard again." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The military transport took her to the airport. She flew to Denver alone, watching the East Coast disappear beneath clouds, leaving behind the hospital that had destroyed her and the base that had saved her. She arrived in Colorado in the afternoon, rented a small apartment near the hospital, and reported for orientation the next morning. The trauma center was massive, twice the size of Riverside General, with modern equipment and a staff that actually seemed to care about their jobs. Her new supervisor was a former Army nurse who'd heard about Sarah's case and specifically requested her for the position. "We need people who don't break under pressure," the supervisor said during their first meeting. "People who've seen the worst and kept working anyway. That's you." Sarah settled into the job slowly, learning new protocols and meeting new colleagues and trying to remember how to exist without looking over her shoulder. The work was demanding but familiar, the same chaos she'd always navigated, just in a different building with different faces. She was good at it, better than good. Within 3 months, the ER staff trusted her completely. Within 6 months, she was running critical trauma codes and training new nurses. Within a year, she'd redesigned their triage protocols and reduced patient wait times by 30%. She built a life in Denver, made friends, started dating someone who worked in hospital administration and didn't flinch when she mentioned her history, bought a small house near the mountains, adopted a dog who barked at strangers and slept at the foot of her bed. She rebuilt herself piece by piece. But some nights she still woke up in a cold sweat, dreaming about Victoria's smile in the courtroom, or the SUV forcing her off the highway, or the moment she'd been fired and escorted through the hospital like trash. Those scars didn't heal fast. Maybe they never would. 2 years after the trial, Sarah received an unexpected email from Jessica Park. The former Riverside general nurse had found work at a small community hospital upstate and wanted to reconnect. They met for coffee during one of Sarah's rare vacation weeks back east. Jessica looked different, older, tired, carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "I'm sorry," Jessica said before Sarah could even sit down. "I should have defended you, should have spoken up sooner, should have been braver." Sarah ordered coffee before responding. "You apologized already, 2 years ago." "I know, but I don't think you heard it. You were too angry, too hurt." Jessica stirred her coffee without drinking. "I need you to know that I think about it every day, about what I should have done differently." "Does thinking about it change anything?" "No, but it matters that I know I was wrong." They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Sarah finally spoke. "I forgive you, not because you earned it, but because carrying anger is exhausting, and I'm tired." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." They talked for another hour, about their jobs, their lives, the wreckage left behind when Riverside General closed. Jessica mentioned that most of the former staff had found new positions, but some had left healthcare entirely. The building itself had been sold to a developer who planned to convert it into condos. "Feels wrong," Jessica said, "like erasing what happened." "Maybe that's better. Fresh start for everyone." Jessica nodded. "What about you? Are you happy?" Sarah thought about her new life in Denver, the work that challenged her, the people who respected her, the dog waiting at home, the therapy sessions she'd finally started attending to process everything that had happened. "Yeah," Sarah said, "I think I am." They parted with promises to stay in touch that both of them knew they probably wouldn't keep. Some relationships existed only in specific moments of crisis and couldn't survive normal life. Sarah drove back to Denver the next day, leaving the East Coast behind again. She returned to work the following Monday and found an envelope waiting on her desk. Inside was a letter from the American Nurses Association, a formal recognition for courage and ethical leadership in exposing institutional corruption. She read it once, filed it away, and got back to work. 3 years after Victoria's sentencing, Sarah received a letter from the prison. Victoria had written to her. Sarah held the envelope for a long time before opening it, debating whether reading it would help or hurt. Finally, curiosity won. The letter was short, handwritten on prison stationery. "Mitchell, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and you don't owe it. I'm writing because my lawyer suggested taking accountability might help at my eventual parole hearing. So here it is. You were right. I was wrong. I let money and power corrupt me until I couldn't tell the difference between business and crime. I destroyed my own life and blamed you for exposing it. That was cowardly. You're probably doing well now. Probably rebuilt your career somewhere people appreciate competence instead of punishing it. Good. You earned that. I'll be here for another 18 years minimum. That's what I earned, Victoria Brennan." Sarah read the letter twice, then burned it in her fireplace. Some people didn't deserve space in your head, even when they tried to apologize. She went to work the next day and saved 3 lives in an 8-hour shift, and came home to her dog and her house in the mountains and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not the absence of pain or memory or consequence, but the quiet certainty that she'd survived something designed to destroy her and came out stronger on the other side. The woman they'd tried to throw away had built something better than they'd ever given her, and that was victory enough. 4 years after the trial, Sarah was promoted to Director of Emergency Services at Denver Memorial. She rebuilt their entire trauma program, implemented new training protocols, and turned their ER into one of the highest-rated emergency departments in the region. She never went back to working under someone who treated staff like disposable resources, never accepted a position where administrators valued profit over patients, never forgot what it felt like to be powerless. And she made damn sure that any nurse working under her supervision would never experience what she had. On the 5th anniversary of her wrongful termination, Sarah received a package from Fort Hamilton. Inside was a plaque engraved with the names of every soldier she'd treated during her deployments. 47 names. Some she remembered clearly, and others she'd forgotten in the chaos of war. The inscription at the bottom read, "For Sarah Mitchell, you didn't leave us behind. We won't leave you behind." She hung it on her office wall where she could see it every day. A reminder that some battles were worth fighting even when the cost felt too high. That truth mattered even when lying was easier. That integrity was something you protected, not something you sold when the price got tempting. Sarah Mitchell had learned those lessons in the worst possible way, but she'd learned them. And somewhere in a federal prison, Victoria Brennan was learning them too. Though whether that knowledge would change her or just make her bitter was something only time would tell. Sarah didn't care which. Victoria's transformation wasn't her responsibility. Her own was. And she'd done the work to become someone worth respecting, someone who'd stood up when it mattered, and refused to break when everyone expected her to fold. The woman who'd been fired for theft she didn't commit had become the director of one of the best emergency departments in the country. The woman who'd been called unstable and unreliable had rebuilt her reputation through competence and courage. The woman they'd tried to destroy had survived. And that was the only revenge that mattered. 7 years after Victoria Brennan went to prison, Sarah Mitchell received a call she'd stopped expecting. She was in her office at Denver Memorial reviewing trauma protocols when her assistant knocked and said there was someone from the parole board on line 2. Sarah stared at the blinking light for 10 seconds before picking up. "Miss Mitchell, this is Sandra Hoffman from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Victoria Brennan has requested you as a character witness for her parole hearing next month." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Excuse me? It's unusual, but she's listed you as someone who can speak to the impact of her crimes and her fitness for early release. You're under no obligation to participate, but I'll be there," Sarah said. The words came out before she'd thought them through, but once spoken, she didn't take them back. Hoffman gave her the details. The hearing was scheduled for March 15th at a federal facility 2 hours outside Denver. Sarah wrote down the information, ended the call, and sat staring at her desk calendar. Victoria wanted her there. The woman who'd tried to destroy her, who'd framed her for theft, who'd attempted to have her killed. That woman wanted Sarah to speak at her parole hearing. The audacity was almost impressive. Sarah called Voss that night. "Don't go," Voss said immediately. "Nothing good comes from reopening that wound." "I'm not going for her. I'm going for me." "What does that mean?" Sarah looked out her window at the Denver skyline, lights flickering against the dark. "It means I need to see what 7 years in prison did to her. I need to know if she actually changed or if she's just learned to fake remorse better. And if she hasn't changed, then I tell the parole board exactly that." Voss was quiet for a moment. "You've moved on, Mitchell, built a good life. Why risk dragging yourself back into that mess? Because some things don't get closure until you face them head on." The weeks leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of work and preparation. Sarah requested witness statements from the parole board, documents detailing Victoria's behavior in prison, her participation in programs, her disciplinary record. The file painted a picture of a model prisoner who'd completed every available rehabilitation course, worked in the prison library, and maintained perfect conduct for 6 consecutive years. On paper, Victoria looked reformed. Sarah didn't trust paper. She drove to the federal facility alone on a cold March morning, declined Voss's offer of accompaniment, and checked in through security by herself. The building was sterile and institutional, concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, the smell of disinfectant and resignation. The parole hearing took place in a conference room with 6 board members seated behind a long table. Victoria was already there when Sarah entered, wearing prison-issued clothing that hung loose on a frame that had lost considerable weight. Her hair was shorter, gray now, and her face carried lines that hadn't existed 7 years ago. Their eyes met across the room. Victoria looked away first. Sarah took her seat in the witness section and waited. The hearing began with administrative details: Victoria's criminal record, her sentence length, her time served. Then the board chair asked Victoria to address the room. Victoria stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "I destroyed lives because I was greedy," Victoria said, her voice steady but quiet. "I stole from the hospital, from patients, from colleagues who trusted me. I framed an innocent woman and tried to ruin her career to cover my own crimes. When that didn't work, I attempted to have her killed." The room was silent. "I spent the first 2 years in here telling myself I was the victim," Victoria continued, "that Sarah Mitchell had overreacted, that the FBI had trapped me, that my lawyers had failed me. It took a long time to accept that I was the architect of my own destruction, that every choice I made was mine, and the consequences were deserved." She paused, looking directly at Sarah now. "I can't undo what I did. I can't give Sarah back the years I stole or erase the trauma I caused. All I can do is acknowledge the damage and accept responsibility. Which is why I asked her to be here today, not because I expect forgiveness, but because she deserves to see that I finally understand what I did to her." Victoria sat down. The board chair turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, would you like to make a statement?" Sarah stood, feeling the weight of 7 years pressing against her chest. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, had written and rewritten it a dozen times. Now, standing in this room with Victoria's eyes on her, she abandoned the script. "Victoria Brennan tried to destroy me," Sarah said simply. "She accused me of theft I didn't commit. She had me fired in the most humiliating way possible. When I exposed her crimes, she fabricated evidence to discredit me in federal court. And when that failed, someone tried to run me off a highway at 70 miles per hour." The board members were writing notes. Sarah continued, "I lost my job, my home, my sense of safety. I spent months in protective custody because Victoria's associates were threatening my life. I had to rebuild my entire existence in a different state just to escape the wreckage she created." Victoria stared at the table, her jaw tight. "But here's what Victoria didn't destroy," Sarah said, her voice getting stronger. "My competence, my integrity, my ability to do the work I was trained for. She took 7 months of my life. I've had 7 years since then to build something better than what she tried to demolish." Sarah looked directly at Victoria now. "I don't forgive you," Sarah said. "I'm not here to give you absolution or help you feel better about what you did. But I will tell this board the truth. You're not the same person who went to prison 7 years ago. I can see that. Whether that change is genuine or performative, I can't know. But you've served your time and met every requirement for parole consideration." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "What happens after this isn't my decision. It's yours. You can walk out of here and become someone who learned from this, or you can revert to who you were and waste the second chance you're being given. Either way, it won't affect my life anymore. I'm done letting you take up space in my head." Sarah sat down. The hearing continued for another hour with testimony from prison officials, Victoria's attorney, and a psychologist who'd evaluated her. Sarah listened to all of it with detached interest, no longer emotionally invested in the outcome. The board deliberated for 30 minutes before announcing their decision. Victoria Brennan was granted parole with strict conditions: 5 years of supervised release, mandatory counseling, community service requirements, and permanent prohibition from working in healthcare or financial management. She would be released in 60 days. Sarah walked out of the facility without speaking to Victoria again. She got in her car, drove 20 miles down the highway, and pulled over at a rest stop where she sat in silence processing what had just happened. She'd expected to feel anger or satisfaction or vindication. Instead, she just felt tired. Not the exhausting tired of carrying weight, the tired of finally being able to set something down. Her phone rang. "Voss." "How'd it go?" Voss asked. "She got parole." "How do you feel about that?" Sarah watched trucks pass on the highway, normal people living normal lives, unaware of the dramas playing out around them. "I feel like it's not my problem anymore." "Good. That's the right answer." I told her I don't forgive her. Also the right answer. Forgiveness isn't mandatory. Voss paused. You okay? Yeah, I actually am. They talked for a few more minutes before Sarah ended the call and continued driving home. She didn't think about Victoria again that day or the next. Life had more important things demanding her attention, a new training program to implement, a funding proposal to write, a date with the man she'd been seeing for 2 years who kept hinting about moving in together. Real life, present life, the life she'd built from ashes. 2 months later, Sarah was supervising a trauma resuscitation when her phone buzzed with a news alert. Victoria Brennan had been released from federal prison that morning. The article included a photo of her walking out wearing donated clothes and carrying a paper bag of belongings. Sarah glanced at the notification and went back to saving a patient's life. Victoria's freedom didn't change anything. Spring turned to summer. Sarah's relationship deepened into something permanent, and she moved into a larger house with her boyfriend Marcus, who worked as an architect and understood the demands of her job because his were similar. They adopted a second dog, planted a garden, hosted dinner parties for colleagues and friends. Sarah's life became full in ways she'd never imagined during those dark months on the military base. She thought about Victoria occasionally, brief flashes of memory triggered by news articles about healthcare fraud or conversations about workplace ethics. But those thoughts had no emotional charge anymore. They were just facts that had happened to someone who used to be her. Then, one afternoon in August, Sarah was leaving the hospital after a particularly brutal shift when she saw a familiar figure standing near the entrance. Victoria Brennan. Sarah stopped walking, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone in her pocket. But Victoria wasn't approaching. She was just standing there holding a coffee cup, looking uncertain. Sarah debated turning around and leaving through a different exit. Instead, she walked forward. Victoria saw her coming and straightened up, the coffee cup trembling slightly in her hands. "I'm not here to cause problems," Victoria said quickly. I needed to see you, to say something I couldn't say in the hearing." "You said plenty at the hearing." "I said what my lawyer told me to say. What would help me get parole." Victoria set down the coffee cup on a nearby bench. "I didn't say what I actually needed to say." Sarah crossed her arms. "You have 2 minutes." Victoria took a shaky breath. "I was jealous of you. That's what started everything. You were good at your job, respected by doctors, trusted by patients. You made nursing look easy when it was destroying me. I resented that. So when I started stealing medication, when the FBI got close, it felt almost righteous to frame you, like you deserved to lose everything because you had things I didn't." Sarah said nothing. "That's the truth I couldn't admit in court," Victoria continued. "It wasn't about money or opportunity or any rational motivation. It was pure jealousy. I wanted to tear you down because watching you succeed made me feel inadequate. And you're telling me this why? Because you deserve to know. Because every time I tried to convince myself I was the victim in this story, I remembered that I targeted you specifically out of spite. That's not something prison fixes. That's just who I was." Victoria picked up her coffee cup again, her hand steadier now. "I'm working at a call center," she said quietly, "taking customer service calls for an insurance company. It's humbling. Nobody knows who I am or what I did. I'm just another voice on the phone helping people file claims." She met Sarah's eyes. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I took from you, and I'm sorry. Not because saying it helps me, but because you deserve to hear it." Victoria walked away without waiting for a response. Sarah stood in the parking lot watching her disappear into the evening crowd, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, that was still too much to offer, but recognition. Victoria had changed. Maybe not completely, maybe not enough, but enough to own the ugliest parts of what she'd done. That was something. Sarah got in her car and drove home where Marcus was cooking dinner and their dogs were playing in the yard and life was waiting to continue without requiring her to carry anger anymore. She walked inside and closed the door on the past. Fall arrived with its usual mountain beauty. Sarah was promoted again, this time to Chief Medical Officer for Denver Memorial's entire emergency services network. The position came with authority to shape policy across multiple hospitals, influence training standards statewide, and advocate for nurses who face the same kind of institutional abuse she'd survived. She used that platform deliberately. Sarah implemented whistleblower protection protocols at every hospital in the network, created anonymous reporting systems for staff who witnessed fraud or misconduct, established a fund to provide legal support for employees who faced retaliation, and made it clear that any administrator caught retaliating against staff for reporting legitimate concerns would be immediately terminated. She turned her trauma into structural change, and she mentored young nurses who reminded her of herself. Competent, overworked, undervalued. She taught them to document everything, trust their instincts, and refuse to be intimidated by people who confused authority with infallibility. "You're allowed to be right," she told a resident nurse who'd been reprimanded for questioning a dangerous medication order. "Actually, you're required to be right. Patient safety matters more than anyone's ego." The nurse looked at her with something like awe. "Nobody's ever said that to me before." "Then you've been working with the wrong people." Sarah built the kind of hospital culture she'd wished existed at Riverside General, where staff felt safe raising concerns, where competence was valued over compliance, where doing the right thing didn't end your career. It was exhausting work. It was also the most meaningful thing she'd ever done. One evening in November, Sarah received an email from Rodriguez, the FBI agent who'd prosecuted Victoria's case. He was writing to inform her that the final defendant from the Riverside General conspiracy had just been sentenced. The pharmaceutical distributor who'd purchased stolen medications had received 18 years in federal prison. The case was officially closed. Every person who'd participated in the fraud scheme was now serving time or had completed their sentences. The corrupt system that had tried to destroy Sarah had been completely dismantled. Rodriguez included a personal note at the end. "You changed how we investigate healthcare fraud. Your testimony became the template for training new agents. Wanted you to know that your courage has ripple effects you'll never see." Sarah read the email twice, then forwarded it to Voss with a single line. "I guess it was worth it." Voss replied immediately, "Always was. You just couldn't see it yet." December brought an unexpected invitation. The American Nurses Association wanted Sarah to speak at their national conference about whistleblower protection and institutional corruption. The keynote address, delivered to thousands of nurses from across the country. Sarah almost declined. Then she remembered every nurse who'd ever felt powerless in the face of administrative abuse, every person who'd witnessed wrongdoing and stayed quiet out of fear, every whistleblower who'd been destroyed for doing the right thing. She accepted. The conference took place in Chicago in February, in a massive convention center filled with nurses who treated her like a celebrity. Sarah found it deeply uncomfortable. She didn't feel heroic, just stubborn, but she understood the symbolism. She represented the possibility that standing up to corruption didn't have to mean career suicide. Sometimes you could win. Sarah stood on stage in front of 3,000 people and told her story without embellishment or drama. She talked about being fired, about the fear and isolation, about living in military housing because her life had been threatened, about the moment Victoria's fake evidence almost destroyed her in court, and she talked about what came after. "I didn't set out to be a whistleblower," Sarah said. "I just refused to be blamed for someone else's crimes. That's not heroism. That's basic self-preservation. But it turned into something bigger because the system was designed to protect corruption instead of exposing it." She looked out at the audience, at faces ranging from young nursing students to veterans with decades of experience. "So here's what I want you to know. You don't have to be special to stand up to wrongdoing. You just have to be stubborn enough to survive the backlash. And if you're facing that backlash now, if you're the nurse who reported something and now you're being punished for it, I need you to hear this. It's not your fault. The retaliation is proof you did the right thing. Bad systems always attack the people who expose them." The audience was completely silent. "I won't tell you it gets easier," Sarah continued. "It doesn't, but it does eventually end. And when it does, you get to build something new, something better. You get to become the kind of leader who protects the next person who has to make the same choice you made." She paused, gathering her final thoughts. "I'm not the same person I was 7 years ago. I'm harder, less trusting, more careful about who deserves my loyalty. But I'm also stronger, more clear-eyed about power and how it gets abused. And I know exactly what kind of institution I want to build. One where competence matters more than compliance, where patient safety overrides administrative convenience, where doing the right thing doesn't end your career." Sarah looked directly at the camera, filming the keynote for virtual attendees. To every nurse watching this who's ever been silenced, scapegoated, or punished for speaking truth, You're not alone. Your experience matters, and the system that hurt you is wrong, not you. Don't let them convince you otherwise. The applause started before she'd even left the stage. Sarah flew home the next day and returned to work where 17 nurses were waiting to talk to her about their own experiences with retaliation. She met with each of them individually, provided resources and referrals, and helped 3 file formal complaints against their employers. The work was never finished, but it was work worth doing. Spring arrived again, marking 8 years since Sarah had been fired from Riverside General Hospital. She was sitting in her office reviewing a policy proposal when her assistant knocked and said someone named Louise Carter was on the phone. Sarah stared at the message slip for a long moment before picking up. "This is Sarah." Louise's voice was older, rougher around the edges. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from." "That's accurate. I'm not asking for anything. I got released 2 months ago, served my full sentence, and I've been thinking about what I need to do to actually make amends for what I did." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "I'm listening. I'm working with a nonprofit now that helps formerly incarcerated people transition back into society, specifically people convicted of healthcare fraud. We're trying to build support networks so people don't end up repeating the same patterns." He paused. "I thought maybe you'd be willing to speak to the group. Not about forgiveness or reconciliation, just about what it's like to be on the receiving end of this kind of betrayal, what harm it actually causes." "Why would I do that?" "Because these people need to hear it from someone who lived through it, from someone whose life we destroyed." Luis's voice cracked slightly. "I can tell them I'm sorry until I'm dead, and it won't matter as much as hearing what it actually felt like to be you." Sarah thought about saying no, about maintaining boundaries and protecting herself from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. Then she thought about the nurses she was mentoring, about the systemic changes she was fighting for, about the fact that transformation required uncomfortable conversations. "Send me the details," Sarah said. "I'll think about it." She spoke to Luis's group 3 weeks later in a community center basement that smelled like coffee and regret. 20 people attended, former nurses, administrators, pharmacists, all of whom had served time for healthcare fraud and were trying to rebuild lives that would never be what they'd been before. Sarah stood in front of them and didn't pull punches. "You didn't just steal medication," she said. "You stole my sense of safety, my ability to trust colleagues, my belief that working hard and doing right would protect me from institutional abuse. When you frame someone for your crimes, you don't just damage their career, you damage their fundamental understanding of how the world works." The room was completely quiet. "Some of you are here because you want to genuinely change," Sarah continued. "Others are here because it looks good for parole officers. I don't care which category you're in. What I care about is that you understand the human cost of what you did, not the abstract legal consequences, the actual lived experience of being destroyed by someone else's greed." She talked for 30 minutes about the aftermath, the unemployment, the threats, the isolation, the way people looked at her differently once her name was associated with scandal. She didn't soften the details or make herself sound heroic. She just told the truth. When she finished, a woman raised her hand. "How did you survive it?" the woman asked. Sarah considered the question. "I didn't survive it alone. I had military connections who protected me. I had resources most people don't have. I got lucky in a lot of ways. But mostly, I survived because giving up would have meant letting the people who hurt me win. And I'm too stubborn for that." She looked around the room at faces that carried their own versions of shame and consequence. "You can't undo what you did," Sarah said. "But you can decide who you are now. You can choose to be someone who learned from this, who does the hard work of actually changing, who spends the rest of their life trying to balance the harm they caused. That won't erase the past, but it might make the future worth something." She left without taking questions. Luis walked her to her car afterward. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That was harder than I expected." "It should be hard. What you did was hard to survive." "I know. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." Sarah unlocked her car. "Being sorry doesn't fix anything, Luis, but it's a place to start." She drove away without looking back. Summer arrived with heat and longer days. Sarah turned 41 and celebrated with Marcus and friends at a restaurant overlooking the mountains. Someone made a toast about her accomplishments. Someone else mentioned the keynote speech that had been viewed over 1 million times online. Sarah smiled and accepted the attention, but felt disconnected from it. She wasn't a hero or a symbol. She was just someone who'd refused to be destroyed and had managed to build something decent from the wreckage. That night, lying in bed next to Marcus with the dog snoring on the floor, Sarah thought about the 8-year journey from that rainy morning in Riverside General's hallway to this moment in a life she'd never imagined possible. "You're quiet," Marcus said. "Just thinking." "About?" Sarah considered how to explain it. "About how the worst thing that ever happened to me ended up creating the life I have now. Not because the trauma was good or necessary, but because surviving it taught me what actually mattered." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Do you wish it had never happened?" "Every day. But I also wouldn't trade who I became for who I was before." They fell asleep like that, comfortable in the complexity of surviving difficult things and learning to live with both the scars and the growth they represented. The following morning, Sarah received an email from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Victoria Brennan had completed her parole and been officially released from supervision. She was, legally speaking, a free woman who'd paid her debt to society. Sarah read the notification once and deleted it. Victoria's freedom didn't diminish Sarah's. 2 years later, Sarah was preparing to testify before a congressional committee on healthcare fraud and whistleblower protection. The invitation had come through the ANA, and Sarah had spent weeks coordinating with policy experts and legal advisors to prepare testimony that would actually move legislation forward. The night before she was scheduled to fly to Washington, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Sandra Hoffman from the Parole Board. I wanted to inform you that Victoria Brennan passed away this morning. Heart attack. Paramedics couldn't revive her." Sarah sat down slowly. "How old was she?" 59. According to her emergency contact, she'd been dealing with heart issues for several years. Prison took a toll. They talked for a few more minutes about logistics and whether Sarah needed to be informed of funeral arrangements. She declined. Victoria's death wasn't her business. They'd stopped being connected the moment Sarah had walked out of that courtroom 10 years ago. After hanging up, Sarah sat in silence, processing the news. Victoria was dead. The woman who'd tried to destroy her was gone, had died relatively young, had paid for her crimes with years of freedom and ultimately with her life. Sarah waited to feel satisfaction or vindication. Instead, she just felt sad. Not for Victoria specifically, but for the waste of it all. The talent Victoria had possessed before corruption consumed her. The lives she could have saved instead of trying to profit from other people's suffering. The person she might have been if she'd chosen differently. Sarah called Voss. "Victoria died," Sarah said. "I heard. Rodriguez sent out a notification to everyone involved in the case." Voss paused. "How are you doing with it?" "I don't know. It feels like it should matter more than it does." "You made peace with it years ago. Death doesn't change that." "I know. I keep thinking about how she died alone. No family at her bedside, no friends, just another former inmate who couldn't rebuild what she'd destroyed." "That's not your responsibility to grieve." "I know, but it's still sad." They talked for another hour about life and death, and the complicated emotions that came with watching your enemies become human. When Sarah finally hung up, she felt lighter somehow. The last thread connecting her to that nightmare had been severed. Victoria was gone. And Sarah was free in ways she'd never been before. Free from looking over her shoulder. Free from wondering if Victoria would seek revenge. Free from carrying anger that had nowhere productive to go. The next day, Sarah testified before Congress with clarity and authority built on 10 years of distance from the trauma. She spoke about systemic failures that enabled healthcare fraud, about the need for stronger whistleblower protections, about creating incentives for reporting wrongdoing instead of punishing people who exposed corruption. 3 senators cited her testimony in floor speeches the following week. 6 months later, Congress passed the Healthcare Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act, with provisions Sarah had specifically recommended. The legislation created federal protections for healthcare workers who reported fraud, established anonymous reporting systems, and imposed mandatory investigations of retaliation claims. It wouldn't prevent every abuse, but it would make the next Sarah Mitchell's fight a little bit easier. 5 years after Victoria's death, Sarah was offered the position of Chief Nursing Officer for the entire Denver Memorial Healthcare System, 12 hospitals, 40 clinics, overseeing 5,000 nursing staff. It was the kind of role she'd never imagined possible when she was getting fired from Riverside General. She accepted, and she used that position to build the healthcare system she'd needed 15 years ago, when nobody was protecting nurses from institutional abuse. She implemented policies that Victoria had violated. She created accountability structures that made corruption harder to hide. She promoted nurses based on competence rather than compliance. She became the kind of leader she'd needed when the system had failed her. The work was never finished. There were always new battles, new abuses, new people who needed protection. But Sarah showed up every day and did the work anyway because she knew what happened when good people stayed silent. On the 20th anniversary of her wrongful termination, Sarah was invited to speak at a memorial event for Riverside General Hospital. The building had been converted to housing, as Jessica had mentioned, but former staff wanted to gather and acknowledge what had happened there. Sarah almost declined. Then she realized it might be important to face that space one final time. She drove to what used to be Riverside General on a spring afternoon, parked in the lot that used to be for employees, and walked through doors that now led to condominiums instead of emergency rooms. The layout had been completely redesigned, but Sarah could still map where the ER had been, where the nurses' station had stood, where she'd been escorted out carrying a box of her belongings. Jessica was there, older now, but recognizable. They hugged carefully, with the awkwardness of people who'd survived something together but hadn't maintained the friendship afterward. "You look good," Jessica said. "So do you." They walked through the building with other former staff, sharing stories about patients they'd saved and shifts they'd survived. Nobody mentioned Victoria directly, but her absence hung over the gathering like smoke. At the end of the event, someone asked Sarah to say a few words. She stood in what used to be the ER and looked at the faces of people who'd watched her get destroyed and hadn't helped. Not because they were evil, but because they were scared and human and imperfect. "This building almost killed me," Sarah said simply. "Not physically, but in every other way that matters. What happened here taught me that institutions will always protect themselves before protecting individuals. That courage is rare. That most people will choose safety over righteousness when forced to choose." She paused, looking around the renovated space. "But it also taught me that surviving something terrible doesn't have to define you forever. That you can build a new life from ashes. That the people who try to destroy you don't get to determine who you become afterward." Sarah met Jessica's eyes. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just tired of carrying weight that doesn't belong to me, so I'm putting it down. Right here, in this building where it started. I'm done letting what happened here follow me around." She meant it. Sarah Mitchell had spent 20 years proving she was more than her worst moment, more than what had been done to her, more than the trauma that had shaped her. She was a nurse who'd saved thousands of lives, a leader who'd changed policy, a mentor who'd protected others from the abuse she'd survived, a person who'd refused to let corruption win, and that was enough. That had always been enough. Sarah walked out of the building that used to be Riverside General Hospital and didn't look back. She got in her car, drove home to the life she'd built, and felt lighter than she had in 2 decades. The woman they'd tried to throw away had not just survived, she'd won. Not through revenge or destruction, but through the simple act of becoming someone worth respecting, someone who'd stood up when it mattered and refused to break when everyone expected her to fold. Victoria Brennan had died alone in a small apartment, forgotten by the world she'd tried to control. Sarah Mitchell was surrounded by people who loved her, respected by colleagues who trusted her judgment, and at peace with the person she'd become. Some victories were quiet, but they were still victories. And Sarah Mitchell had earned every single one.